Proximate and ultimate explanations. Our learning objectives for this video are to 1. Explain the difference between proximate and ultimate explanations, and to 2. Describe Tinbergen's 4 questions of analysis. In 1951, biologist Ernest Mayr suggested that biologists split up their explanations into 2 distinct categories, proximate and ultimate. Proximate explanations describe the mechanism underlying a trait or condition. So, for example, describing the physiology, hormones, genes, or development that underlies a certain biological trait would be a proximate explanation. In other words, they try to explain how a mechanism functions. On the other hand, ultimate explanations describe the evolutionary explanation of a trait or condition, such as its adaptive function or its phylogenetic history. In other words, they try to explain why a mechanism exists. Today, using multiple types of explanations to provide a comprehensive biological understanding of a trait is the backbone of evolutionary medicine and many other fields in the life sciences. Before the dawn of Darwinian medicine, the Dutch ethologist Nico Tinbergen famously applied this approach to the field of animal behavior. While studying the behavior of herring gulls, Tinbergen noticed that when chicks peck at the beaks of their parents, the parents provide them with food by regurgitating some out. After a series of experiments, he concluded that this is an innate behavior that the newly hatched chicks will perform when exposed to the red dot on the tip of their parent's beak. But interestingly, he noticed this behavior still occurred even if it was from an artificial stimulus, such as on the end of a stick. Innate basically means that the behavior is instinctual, and the fact that it occurs without any prior experience highly suggests that it's adaptive, or in other words, has been shaped by natural selection. A proximate explanation in this case would be that the herring gull chicks peck at their parents' beak when they see a red spot. And an ultimate explanation would be that the chicks peck at their parents' beak because it provides them with food that is ultimately required for growth, survival, and later down the line, reproduction. Today, like evolutionary medicine, animal behavior is a highly integrated field that relies on evolutionary perspectives, a large part due to Tinbergen's work. In 1963, Tinbergen further refined these ideas by splitting them into causation, development, adaptive, and phylogeny. So 2 questions that are proximate and 2 that are ultimate. Take a look at these 4 questions in a bit more detail. Number 1, causation. Also known as mechanism, causation questions ask what biological mechanisms are directly responsible for the characteristic. So this would include factors such as hormones, neurotransmitters, and genes. For example, different areas of the human brain are responsible for different biological functions. The function of Broca's area, found on the frontal lobe of the cortex, acts as a causal explanation for language production. This was discovered when the physician Paul Broca noted 2 patients lost the ability to produce speech after they received damage to this area of the brain. Number 2, development. Development, also referred to as ontogeny, asks questions related to what environmental factors that influence development are responsible for this characteristic. So this would include factors such as exposure to certain stimuli during critical periods and early life nutrition. So in an example below, an experiment showed that depriving cats of vision during different developmental periods resulted in lasting changes to their vision later in life. When kittens were deprived of vision for the first month of their life, which is a critical period for visual development, they suffered impaired vision for the rest of their lives. However, kittens deprived of vision for the same amount of time, but in the second month of their life, went on to develop completely normal visual capabilities. Number 3, adaptive. Also called functional, adaptive questions ask how does the characteristic influence the individual's ability to survive and reproduce? So in evolutionary lingo, how does it influence their fitness? Elephant seals have a polygynous mating system, which means a single male will mate with multiple females by obtaining harems, which is a group of reproductive females. The male that gains access to these harems is determined by aggressive male-male conflicts that often result in severe injury and sometimes even death. So even though engaging in these intense competitions can often result in mortal costs, this aggressive behavior can still be explained as an adaptation because the male with the highest competitive success gains access to mating rights in the group for the entire breeding system. So this basically means his alleles will be well represented in the next generation. Number 4, phylogeny. Also known as evolutionary, phylogenetic questions ask how did evolutionary processes over many generations result in the evolution of the characteristic. So, for example, take the human eye. The complexity of the human eye makes it a common target for arguments of intelligent design, but evolution is a gradual process that occurs over many generations, and understanding of the human eye not only requires an analysis of our own evolutionary history, but that of the ancestral species that had earlier forms of the now modern eye. So it's not like a species went from having no eye to a complex modern eye over one generation, but rather many years ago, a species existed that could perceive a little bit of light with some photoreceptor cells, and that gave it a slight advantage because it knew where light was. And then eventually it formed into a concave surface that allowed it to determine the direction of the light, and so on and so forth, until we have resulted into a complex eye that can perform many features such as depth perception and color perception. Right, now let's take a multi-level analytical approach to a condition related to human health, a fever. So in terms of causation, a fever is an immune response, and it occurs when our immune system detects a foreign pathogen that might be harmful to our body, and a fever might be triggered. In terms of development, previous exposure to the same or a similar pathogen can influence our immune system's ability to eliminate the pathogen without triggering a fever due to pre-existing immunity. A functional explanation is that fevers actually make it more difficult for invading pathogens to survive and replicate within our bodies. It also slightly increases metabolism, which can improve the efficiency of our immune function. And finally, from a phylogenetic approach, as it turns out, all vertebrates have some sort of fever response. So warm-blooded animals can actually influence their internal body temperature, but even cold-blooded animals such as reptiles display what's called a behavioral fever. So when they're infected with a pathogen, they'll seek out and bask in sources of heat for longer periods of time than usual. So when looking at this multi-analytical approach, if we only focus on the proximate explanations, it might seem like a good idea to take antipyretic medication, so medication that reduces fevers like Tylenol, when experiencing symptoms of a mild fever. But when we take the ultimate explanations in perspective as well, do you still think it's always the best idea? Well, as it turns out, studies have demonstrated that antipyretic medication can actually have detrimental effects when taken to treat a fever. So they increase mortality when used in critical care and in influenza infections, and they even increase viral shedding, which can result in increased transmission throughout the population and increased illness. The hypothesis that drove these studies to exist in the first place can only have been generated when considering the ultimate explanations along with the proximate ones. So to summarize this video, describing multiple types of explanations can help provide a more comprehensive view of biological traits. And in other words, it can help us see the bigger picture more clearly. And we can take this approach by dividing our explanations into proximate and ultimate ones, and furthermore into Tinbergen's 4 questions of causation, development, adaptive, and phylogeny. Well, that's all for today, and we will see you next time.